Welcome to this short lecture from the Steiner Academy, Exeter, where we are looking at an aspect of the Steiner Waldorf curriculum, and particularly this morning on the Phasic Curriculum. I'm going to start off with a concrete example in terms of one of the subject areas that we work with in Class 8, which is Year 9 in the National Curriculum, looking at revolution. And one of the key differences in Steiner Waldorf education is that we're not actually teaching in terms of content. So the sequence of the curriculum content is not planned solely towards a final qualification, and the building blocks are not oriented towards that goal. Instead, all of the curriculum content and actually the student's experience is geared towards their own development. So there's a very purposeful design in what the students learn in every year of their education. And that's a key difference of Steiner Waldorf education. So the practical example of studying revolution in Class 8 is something I'm going to come back to at the end, but I'm going to start with a little bit of a context for why we're actually looking at this and why we're describing it as a phasic curriculum. One of the challenges for the Steiner Waldorf movement in the UK at the moment is a real concern as to its underlying principles of the pedagogy itself. And to even talk about a pedagogy is something that introduces a level of technical language in education that in terms of teacher training is absolutely essential. But it's not always been there in terms of Steiner Waldorf education. And there is a level of reputation and to some extent a level of reality to the accusation of Steiner Waldorf education being a little anti-intellectual. So we had colleagues from Ofsted in a few months ago in May 2018, and there was a real question from one of the HMIs in terms of whether we as a school had a universal language in terms of what we were intending to do with our curriculum. And there was a reflection that some aspects of the teaching community were either very diverse or actually split in terms of what we were wanting. And I think that was a very accurate observation. And I think that there is a tension in some aspects of Steiner Waldorf education in the UK which does reflect an anti-intellectualism. So John Burnett, one of the torchbearers for Steiner Waldorf in the UK, said some years ago that in the 1960s there was a huge influx to Steiner Waldorf communities by people who were what he described as refugees from intellectualism. And I think he meant that in a number of different ways. One, a critique of a very head-oriented learning that was separate from more emotional intelligence. And I think one of the things that Steiner Waldorf education does really well is to integrate emotional intelligence with cognitive development. But one of the things he was also talking about was a real resistance to excellence in intellectual endeavour that could be there in Steiner Waldorf education. And certainly if you look at the third quote here, I remember I arrived at this school a couple of weeks before the fated Ofsted inspection of 2018, and one of the teachers talked to me at that point. I'd sent an email talking about pedagogy, and the teacher came and found me and said, I have to look that word up in the dictionary. And for me, I had a bit of an issue with that because there's an expectation from my point of view in terms of the quality of teacher training in the UK. It's postgraduate. It's at a master's level, so all teachers in the UK should be working at a master's level and also should have a hunger for new words, should have a hunger for new knowledge. And I think that that was it certainly was a turning point for this school. Of course, over the next 15-20 minutes, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give some practical classroom implications for a phasic curriculum. But I'm also going to cycle back to those underlying principles because I think it's our responsibility as Steiner Waldorf educators to look in a broader context, not only nationally, but also globally. So we're not in an island as Steiner Waldorf educators, we're part of a global community wanting the best for children. And I think there's a huge amount in the Steiner Waldorf tradition that has got immediate practical application in a broader context. And I think the key thing to say there is to reprise Claire Fox's comment about education generally. She made this comment some years ago. She said that in the UK there's a philosophy gap in the educational movement. There tends to be fads and fashions, there tends to be one intervention that is identified as effective in the classroom, and then that's bolted on by patchwork to a broader goal in terms of student attainment. There's a little bit of a lack in the UK of a general philosophical principle about what we're doing in education in the first instance. And I think in some ways that probably reflects our diversity, you could say, as a culture. But I also think that there are enough educators out there who've been identifying this philosophy gap for long enough for it to be really time for us as a community to actually offer something that's significantly different. And the other reference I'm putting up there is this amazing piece of work that's been done by Erin Meyer at the moment in terms of global cultures, in terms of communication. So whether we are a low context culture, in terms of communication, do we say what we mean and mean what we say? Or are we very high context? Are the nuances in terms of why we're saying, how we're saying things, very much born in cultures like Japan? Now, I accept that the UK and the US and Canada, etc., are very low context in terms of communication. But there's a significant aspect here in terms of persuasion, in terms of communication. And that is the difference between being specific and actual and holistic. And so the UK tends to be very specific. So if I was to do this lecture just for a UK audience, what I should be doing is giving you example after example after example, practical classroom application. But Steiner Waldorf education tends to be more holistic. It's a cultural anomaly in the UK, and its global impact is huge. But its global centre of gravity does tend to be more oriented towards a philosophical driver and holistic thinking. And I need to point that out now because it's our challenge as Steiner Waldorf educators in the UK that we need to constantly bear that in mind as we communicate to parents and as we communicate to fellow teachers. It's got a huge advantage. So this September, in a few weeks' time, Ofsted are working a new inspection framework, given there's a 12-month transition period. But the whole context of a curriculum's intention, its implementation and its impact is going to be, I think, is going to have a huge impact in terms of a pendulum swinging in education towards more of a holistic approach to children's development and education. I think it's going to give a level of impact back in the hands of teachers as opposed to school managers and school principals. And I actually feel really optimistic about it. Now we can have a conversation about that at some point, but I think it's going to have a huge impact. I think it's got an implication for Steiner Waldorf education because I think it's going to give us an opportunity to explain some of the aspects of that coherent stream of what we're trying to do in the education itself. And one of the central aspects, and what I'm wanting to talk to you about today, is a phasic curriculum, about how the curriculum is geared in phases. So it's not just a sequence of learning where you've got building blocks, but you're actually trying for an experience at every year level. And this is very similar to the work of Jean Piaget, where you have stages of development. And this is often taught in basic teacher training. And I reference this now, we can talk about this later again. One of the things I do want to point out is that this is a little bit outdated now, the work of John Hattie in terms of meta-analysis. So this is very much been updated by the work of the EEF in the UK in terms of what interventions have the biggest impact upon students' progress. And the work that John Hattie did, he really identified top 4 or 5 main impacts main interventions that are going to have more impact upon a student's progress. And one of them was Piagetian programs. So you actually have a program as a structure for a curriculum that actually has an awareness of the student experience and student thinking, as opposed to just filling boxes, about filling content. To actually have an insight into what the children's thought processes are, has an immediate impact upon classroom progress, rather than just thinking, what do they have to learn? And I think it's that context that's really important in terms of putting Steiner Waldorf education's work in a broader context. It's been taken slightly further. So if I go back to Piaget, he had a fourth stage between 11 and 16 about formal operational thinking. This is where the student starts that abstract thinking to conceptualize knowledge. And to develop an understanding of how the world works. The work of Joe Kincello, who's an educationalist who worked in the States, he actually suggested that there was a post-formal stage of learning that in the last 30 years has really developed in terms of systems thinking, in terms of more holistic ideas of knowledge. And he related that to the emotional literacy and emotional intelligence. He also linked it to post-colonial ideas of knowledge, so that it wasn't just strict categorical knowledge, but more intuitive work. But he really related a lot to the First Peoples of the Americas, and to tribal knowledge that I think that we're starting to see in some of the ecological thinking. That's for another time, but I just want to mark that at this point. I also want to say that this is not unchallenged, this work, and David Willingham, another American psychologist who works in the area of education, he actually questions the value of teaching mental models of learners to future educators. And he actually will argue for more practical impact in the classroom. So this is not uncontested, but there is enough here of a core idea in education for the value of future research, and in terms of action research for us as a community, certainly here in Exeter, I think it's got legs. We need to pay attention to it. The other aspect to it, in terms of phasic development, is that there's certain things that happen in terms of sensory-motor integration that we pay particular attention to. So traditionally in Steiner Waldorf schools, we do what's called a Class 2 check. So at around the age of 8, we do various things like stereoscopic vision. Can the children see in a balanced way out of both eyes? Can they cross their midline in terms of right to left, where it's catching exercises? And also, is their auditory range okay? Is it geared towards specifically to English, which is a very high frequency pitched language? And this is work that's been going on for a long time in the Steiner Waldorf community. However, it's not in isolation. There's some superb work that's very similar done in mainstream, not universally. And I just want to highlight the work of Charlotte Davis down in Croydon, and there's a YouTube link there to her video, and I very much recommend this. And the work that Charlotte and other colleagues are doing is very much around sensory-motor integration. And she passionately believes that this kind of check should be done for all school children. It should be done also for all people who present with mental health problems, and also people who in our prison populations. Because that ability to, first of all, to sit up straight. You know, is there enough core strength for a child to be able to sit up? So telling a child to sit up when they actually don't have the physical musculature to be able to do that is slightly crazy. And so the integration of movement programs in kindergarten particularly is really important, to be able to then, in class 1, to be able to sit at a desk. And if your child is not physically able to do that, it's crazy then introducing a behaviour program which actually disciplines a child for not sitting up. So I want to provide that as a context for the excellent work that's going on beyond Steiner Waldorf education, and that Steiner Waldorf educators have a responsibility to reference in this broader national conversation. And when I was at the Steiner Academy in Hereford, I remember being in a court competition in class 7 and having a conversation with a visiting judge who looked at some of the nice crocheted badges that our Steiner Waldorf candidates had on, and just being really intrigued why they weren't just paper stick-on badges of different colours, and that they'd actually crocheted them. And I gave him some kind of explanation, but that included the idea of nimble fingers, nimble minds. So those students who were part of a court competition had actually actively crocheted their own badges. And you know, it's a little bit of a stereotype, but the fact that Class 1 Steiner children learn to knit, and that's not just because it's some kind of folksy tradition, but it's intentful in terms of developing that hand-eye coordination, that will activity of being able to, or if you drop a stitch, being able to pick it up again. It's absolutely essential to what we are doing. And one of the things that Charlotte Davis, who I previously mentioned, she talks about Indian dance as at the top of the tree in terms of hand-eye coordination. And she also talks about in her video as to one of the reasons, and I think there are many, why many Asian girls are so good at maths in terms of UK demographics, in terms of those cultural activities that will actually be the basis for later cognitive development. And that whole idea about motor sensory integration as the basis for higher cognitive skills is absolutely central. Before I move on to each individual class, I want to give a bit of a broader context to the Steiner Waldorf philosophy and the way that some of those Aristotelian virtues are brought forward by Rudolf Steiner in terms of what happens in those broad 7-year cycles. And in terms of coming to look at what exactly happens in Class 1 and what exactly is going on in the curriculum, Steiner very much places it in a broader existential journey. So I think that it's probably valid to describe the Steiner Waldorf curriculum as an existential curriculum. It's not just a knowledge-based curriculum, it's actually helping human beings develop to be effective in the world across head, hands and heart. However you want to carve up the human experience, it's not just about head knowledge, and Steiner Waldorf attempts to be holistic in that way. However, there are certain phases where certain aspects of development are learned more, and Steiner splits those up into 7-year cycles. Very much in the early years and in kindergarten, there's the experience of that the world is good. And that gesture from the teachers starts off with an ability, the world is good, the world is safe, I can care for you, I can protect you, and you are loved. It's a primary message of all of early years. In the class teacher phases, between the ages of 7 and 14, it is beauty, but it's not an aesthetic beauty that's superficial. Here, there's the beauty as a shuttle between different experiences, and this is where the art of education comes in. Art as an ability to moderate experience. When I did my teacher training, we did a lot of art, and it wasn't to be able to draw. We didn't learn art in order to be able to draw, in order to be able to reproduce blackboard drawings. It was as much to be able to moderate our own emotional experience as anything else. So this quality of art as to be able to engage with emotional literacy is key in Steiner Waldorf education, all the way through. And so one example that comes up into upper school, so even though 16-year-old children, the realm is of truth, and the gesture from the teacher that's being demanded is of authenticity and integrity, there's still art, there's still handwork. And one of my first teacher trainers, Karen up at Hereford, she was really passionate. She was a science teacher, but she also taught handwork. And the opportunity for 16-year-olds in doing handwork to also talk about their social experiences, their emotional challenges. It's not just doing a counselling session that's separate from the rest of the curriculum. This is an integrated curriculum where you're offering an opportunity for social dialogue, for social interaction around craft. And that ability to be cross-curricular and integrated is something that, particularly here at Exeter, we're very much doing through landcraft rather than handcraft. But those broad phases of what we're actually wanting to do in terms of the Phasic curriculum then get split up into more year-specific journeys. And what we've got here, so there's very many curriculum guides to Steiner Waldorf education online that actually described the main lesson theme, the journey in maths, in English, about when particular subjects start to be taught more specifically. So history and geography start towards later lower school and more middle school, etc., etc. So those are there. There's some fantastic published books on them. But I think sometimes, from my point of view, particularly in talking to non-Steiner Waldorf trained teachers, the bigger picture and the broader overview of actually what's happening is sometimes missed. And I think it's really important to emphasize the idea of a phasic curriculum, that you're not teaching a certain topic at a certain time just so students learn stuff. It's not content driven, it's experience driven. So for instance, in class 3, they learn about shelters. Now they're not just then learning about engineering, they're not just learning about architecture, house design. It's not a geography lesson, it's not a history lesson in terms of shelters. It's an opportunity to offer them, as they turn 8, 9, as they enter into the Rubicon in terms of the crossing point, the turning point of a relationship with teachers, a relationship with parents, where they start to get more of a sense of self, to actually build a shelter which they could fit in, has an impact psychologically that is the primary intent of that part of the curriculum. So you learn about shelter building in class 3, not from a historical or geographical or engineering point of view, but as an existential experience of I have shelter in the world. In class 7 you learn about the age of exploration, not to know what happened in terms of European explorers into the Americas, but as a parallel correspondence in terms of your own journey into the world. And it's through that the curriculum itself is intended to match the inner psychological experience of children, but also as a framework for them understanding their bodies as well. So the mechanics main lesson that happens in middle school across class 7 or 8 happens at the same time that the long bones lengthen. So where the limbs lengthen in a way that's not yet integrated into the rest of the body, and the gangliness that happens around that early adolescent phase is an ideal time to talk about levers. Is an ideal time to talk about the mechanics of how the actual human body works, and to have that correspondence so that there is a place in the world for the students. The more in the Steiner Waldorf curriculum that you can reflect the inner experience with what's happening outside in the world, the more the fundamental message that I have a place in the world is actually anchored. So thanks for listening. I hope that's given some food for thought, and I look forward to various dialogues across the community.